certain habits and certain identity structures around the world are obsolete. They need to be dissolved. And the dissolution of those structures makes space for new structures to emerge that fit our time better than the former ones.
Welcome to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl, a podcast that illuminates the path to collective healing at the intersection of science and mysticism. This is the Point of Relation. The following episode was recorded during a previous online course with Thomas Hübl. Visit thomashübl.com to learn more about upcoming courses and events.
In my understanding, the evolution or development of systems depends very much on, let's say, a regulated response to the necessity of change. Like a regulated response to the necessity of change. What does that mean? The system has naturally, as it develops, let's say as we jump from 2 billion world population to 8 billion world population, the system has changed, and that there is a necessity to develop. So there's a necessity to change, and that certain habits might continue, certain habits and certain identity structures around the world are obsolete. They need to be dissolved. And the dissolution of those structures makes space for new structures to emerge that fit our time better than the former ones. So it's not that the former ones are bad altogether. Maybe some were based on transgressions and trauma, and we will talk about that, but there is like a movement needed. And so certain structures or identity structures are dissolving. But what's also dissolving is some of the compensation mechanisms that held the trauma in place, because there's a lot of pressure onto those compensation mechanisms. And so when they fall apart, they don't open up, make space for new and become new structures. They actually release a lot of pain. So I would say we are living in a time that I would call the great detox. So we are in a time of great detox, but we often pathologize that detox as something that is like a personal pathology or a personal struggle, and we shouldn't have that personal struggle. We should actually be always on top of things and go through it in a good way or in a great way, which means I have everything under control. But in this moment, we don't have everything under control. And we are actually going through phases individually and collectively of detoxing. And I will talk more about this, layers of stored material that have to come up for us to grow. And so in this work here, in our work, we call this the IAC fluidity, individual, ancestral, and collective trauma on the one hand, but also individual, ancestral, and collective liquefaction, like liquefying frozen trauma structures or frozen societal structures. And many of them that we have been born into a world that already had that landscape in place. So it didn't start with us. And so we grew up in that landscape. And part of that landscape is emerging, evolving naturally, is open, is relational, is free to receive innovation, to receive the future, to turn that future into innovative processes, innovative companies, innovative science breakthroughs, innovative social movements. So it's like there is innovation landing and becoming something. But where innovation hits a lot of trauma, the innovation actually is like seeds on ice. And the seeds on ice don't grow or don't grow well. And so parts of our individual lives, we know this in ourselves. Parts of us might, like in some parts of my life, I might flourish and develop, and it's beautiful. And in some parts of my life, it's much harder. And then I feel the tension or the discrepancy between those. And then when we say there's individual development, there is attachment, of course, and there's our developmental process, and we mature, and then there's grown up learning and maturation and development. So we are all the time in a process of maturing. And maturation means growing wiser. Maturation means I can host more of the world in me, which means I have space inside myself to host more of the complexity of the world. But it also means I have more space to host discomfort, and I have more space to host contradictions. But where I'm hurt, it's very hard for me to host more of the world because I can't even host myself. And there we struggle. And so for our exploration over this time, I would love to invite us into a contemplation of a few principles. One is that we want to open the landscape of trauma and say, of course, many people unfortunately go through, they meet in their life overwhelming situations, either as children or throughout our life, where trauma happens or recurrent trauma happens. So there is definitely individual trauma, and that needs to be treated in a certain way. And I think everybody who is a professional here does that in their ways. And we say that exists, and that individual trauma is embedded in a bigger system which has ancestral roots. Our ancestors went through trauma. So or through transgression. And we are living in a society that all the relationships that we create and the societal structures that we create are partly based on open, emergent, developing processes, and are partly based on repetitive, reenacting, disrelated, non-emergent processes that have no future. And I want to say that again. So emergent means we have a future. And in some parts of ourselves, even as an individual, I have a future. These parts, I feel they are moving, they're developing. Maybe there are parts in me that are already for 20 years kind of on the same level. So it means there's something looping, there's a cyclic pattern that is not being fertilized by the future. It doesn't get updates. And that's not that it's good or bad, because we often tend to look at these processes, oh, this is good and this is not good. And I want for our exploration to depathologize that for a moment and say, okay, let's have a look what's moving, even if it's moving in small steps, but it's moving, and what seems to be like a CD that's replaying itself all the time in cycles. And there's very little or no movement. It's more frozen. It's more held in place. And that in between these various parts, there are tension patterns. There's tension in between. And maybe all of us know that in ourselves to a certain extent. And then we look at similar processes in the world, in the society. And then as we look at that, we also notice, maybe, for example, especially with a climate crisis, that everybody who is a professional, like a therapist, social worker, any kind of professional that works with clients or people, we we go through that kind of collective process, and our clients too. And then there is the complexity of sitting in the same water and also being somebody that actually treats clients professionally, at the same time being affected by the same situation. And so for everybody professionally, it's important to hold that complexity and actually have a two-level evolution in myself and also for my clients. So that's also exciting because there's a lot of learning potential, there's a lot of developmental potential in it, but we need spaces where we have the right reflection environment, like an environment to reflect and start to kind of surface more in ourselves. Okay, what's my relationship in it? Where do I keep myself out of that question? I don't have time. I am too busy. I'm having it together. I'm not affected by it. Or I really allow myself to be in the inquiry and see what's my relationship to a state of when we call it polycrisis, multiple crisis impacts that are happening for me, that are happening for people around me, maybe professionally. And we wanted to create the space where we can first have that exploration and then see what's the developmental outcome personally and professionally. And so, again, the collective intelligence is based on feedback loops that are part of a regulation that make a responsiveness or create the ability to respond. Responsibility is the ability to respond to the life circumstances. So it's responsive, and response is relational. Reactivity is based on the past mainly. When I become reactive, I get triggered, and then I'm responding from either a younger, more regressive, or more limited place that is more polarized already. Either it's hyperactivated or it's hypoactivated. So there is a split. So either I become more indifferent, distant, and pulled out, or I'm more anxious or angry. So I'm more in fight or flight. Or we see the same symptoms in our society. And so I want to speak a little bit about this notion that individuals are kind of like separate from their ecosystem, or individuals are the ecosystem. So, am I as an individual on the planet, or am I as an individual also the planet? That's a difference. That's a difference in how we feel, how connected we feel to like a bigger interconnectedness of life. And it also might inform my thinking. And it might inform also my professional perspective. If I am the planet, I am nature, I am a human being, or I'm a human being that is in nature. Oh, that's different. Am I also nature, or am I in nature? Am I like a glass that you can that is in the cupboard, Or am I an interrelated whole while I'm also an individual viewpoint? And in that, what seems like semantics, so it seems like it's different ways of expression, I think is a big difference in experience. And when I am when I am as nature, then there is a fluidity between my individual self, my roots that go deep into the ground. My roots are also my ancestors, where I come from. There's a data transfer, there's an alive data transfer, an ancestral data transfer that lives in my ancestral nervous system, the part of my nervous system that encodes the information and that I use to sense ancestors, for example, in my clients. That ancestors are not just intellectual memories, ancestors are embodied information. That when we tune in with collective spaces, and we, like Otto Schama tends to say, we practice system sensing or systemic sensing, that sensing is being done by a part of our nervous system. So, same as we can sense individuals, I feel you, and I feel you feeling me, or I feel you being absorbed in yourself. So, or I feel you partly feeling me and partly not, because when trauma comes into play, the relationship is hurt. So then we can feel relational dynamics as we go through different processes. Some processes are very open and related. Some of them are very withdrawn and held inside. So we have that relational awareness when we listen to somebody. We can have a similar ancestral attunement, that our ancestors are actually information we can feel and tune in with. And that creates an ancestral holding space. Same as I have an individual holding space, I have an ancestral holding space. And if we hold space for organizations, if we hold space for collective trauma, so we are creating a collective holding space, which is not just the idea of, oh, we are talking about collective trauma. It's we're systemically sensing, we're feeling into the historical, archaeological layers that are stored in a certain society, in a certain group in a society. Because the trauma information is held. There's a part of, that's why it's repeating itself. It's held in a time trap. Once it's integrated and more, when it starts to heal and integrate, then it becomes movement and learning. So we learn by liquefying some of that in a titrated way. We liquefy some of the trauma, and the trauma becomes post-traumatic learning and growth, flourishing. And so when we are systemically sensing, as we started in the meditation, when we are all here and we are all creating a space through our attention and through our intention. And I believe our spine, through our central nervous system, runs the intention that our life has through us. Our spine is like a pillar. It's like it's a line. That line is an intention. And so through our intention to be together for this time, we are creating a space. Everybody who signed up for this course is an intention to create like a space. And again, the more we are aware of that space, the more presence and sensing we bring into this space, it becomes a more present holding space on different levels of of what we can sense and connect to. And you see already sensing, that's why I think sensing is such an important capacity, because cognition and sensing is sense making. If I can sense and think and they're aligned, things make sense. When a person tells you something and you can feel it and you can hear it intellectually and it's congruent and things make sense. When somebody tells you something and the body feels something else than the intellectual information, then it doesn't fully make sense. Even if you understand intellectually what the person said, emotionally and physically, it's not fully congruent. It doesn't fully make sense. I understand what you're saying, but it doesn't fully make sense. And that's not good or bad. That's just a symptom of the process, but it's an important symptom. So, why am I saying that? Because when we look at our topic here in the face of a polycrisis, we see often we are used to, like over a long time of history, we are used to cyclic phases of crisis, because if the evolutionary energy cannot fulfill its change and pushes against prior trauma or non-emergence, so there will be a lot of tension until that tension one day discharges itself through a crisis. And if we can volunteer to work on the frozenness and liquefy it as we develop, so maybe we can change that cycle of crisis and development into a more fluid development. But it doesn't work without getting to the underbelly. That's why I said at the beginning, I think some of the symptoms that we feel in ourselves, for example, climate anxiety, climate depression, or lack of motivation, being detached from certain parts of our own process and motivation or agency, are maybe personal, of course, connected to our personal development. But I believe that right now we see also a lot of the archaeology, the unresolved archaeology of humanity trying to detox itself. And it seems like, as when we look into society, of course, besides some groups on the marginal areas of society, but that we don't have a very good mainstream ritual, that we have mainstream rituals to integrate, to digest and integrate our archaeology, the residues in our culture. We're more and more waking up to the fact that there is that residue, and maybe in wisdom cultures around the world, there's thousands of years of wisdom. In indigenous wisdom cultures, in mystical wisdom cultures, there's a lot of wisdom around integrating the past, and so for our exploration, I would love us to think and feel and tune in with these various levels of detox that are happening, like a great detox of material that comes up in the form of emotions, that comes up in the form of detachment, like all the various trauma symptoms, and get into this a bit more, that something needs to integrate itself, that is not just personal, that ancestral and collective material needs to move. And we do have, and maybe I will mention only a few today, we do have some great contributors to to the situation we are in that are maybe good also in between to contemplate a bit, some home practice. And one of those is that I believe what we see in democracies around the world is that democracies, because of a certain level of safety in democracies, that safety allows us to bring out voices that are important, that were suppressed for some time. So there's a detox happening, and the detox looks like that we are very challenged. Like a group in a group process goes to a new level of safety, then there is an eruption of material. That eruption is actually the way to a new level of safety. If it's being facilitated well, it becomes more soil. It becomes more ground. It becomes a safer container. And that safer container allows more stuff to detox. And so when we look at democracies, I think we see the disruption and the fragility of important information that's surfacing that needs to be facilitated in some way to cohere to a new level of development. So I think that's one process we see. Another process we see is that I believe the pressure on the biosphere, the stress within the biosphere through climate change and loss of biodiversity is bigger than most of the people are aware of. Because our bodies are nature. We are not just, there's not just nature around me. I am nature. And my body is not separate from that stress. My body is in the ecosystemically is that stress also. So there is, even if I can regulate myself individually, we are also holding, and I think we are developing the skill how to regulate our collective nervous system. And in the next session, we will practice a bit with the collective nervous system here. But the regulation of our ancestral and collective nervous system is a skill we have to learn. Otherwise, we are exposed to a lot of impact. Because I believe we are not just these separate individuals, but we are actually plugged into this supercomputer we call biosphere. And so there is this, the pressure and the loss of biodiversity is not just happening outside. You might say, oh, we're losing species like outside. And the question is that really true? Or is in the interdependence also something being lost in us inside? And we are not yet fully there to maybe fully comprehend that process or notice what the effects are. We are just seeing a rise of many, many symptoms in the world. So I think that's a good question. I don't want to go deeply into that now. I want to just spark a little bit contemplation and walking a bit, maybe writing a bit for us to journal a bit about these different functions, how it affects you, maybe how it affects, if you work with clients, how this affects your clients, how this affects systems that you work with, if you work in organizations, what kind of symptoms might show up in organizations or in society. I think it's trauma-informed policy making is a very important part. So there's lots of space for exploration and also social or cultural impact work.
Thanks for listening to Point of Relation with Thomas Hübl. Stay connected and get updates about new episodes by visiting our website, pointofrelationpodcast.com, and by subscribing to the Thomas Hübl YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video, please like it and share about us with your community on social media. Thank you. We appreciate your support.